magic. Hey, I'm Anthony, and today we're going to talk about different ways of deploying ASP.NET apps to Docker containers. Just a show of hands, how many of you guys use ASP.NET 4.5 or 4.6 right now? Okay, it's a lot of people, so hopefully this will be kind of interesting for you guys. Do you guys hear me okay? Yep. All right, cool. So I'll start off with a little bit of history on Docker. So containers have been around in Linux for like a super long time. But it wasn't until Docker came along that, that they really became easy to use and accessible for pretty much the ordinary people. What they really are is there's just a lightweight form of virtualization. So they're like a virtual machine. You can kind of think of them like virtual machines, but they're not virtual machines. So what are some of the differences? I think the biggest difference is that in each instance of a virtual machine, we're actually running a copy of the operating system kernel in there as well. So that takes up a lot more resources compared to containers, which share the host operating system kernel. So the only things that are running inside the container are the application itself and its dependencies. So, yeah, we're able to run a lot more apps on the same hardware. As well, we can start up containers a lot faster as well, usually in a second or so versus maybe in seconds or minutes for virtual machines. So a little bit about the architecture. So in Linux, we have the operating system on the bottom. That kind of has the services that are that kind of enable containers to function. And then we have Docker Engine, which talks to these services to actually make containers happen. And Docker Engine exposes a REST API that the rest of the Docker clients talk to. So the Docker CLI, Docker Compose, and Docker Swarm all talk to that through the REST API. So one of the most important things, or the biggest advantages of using Docker is this elimination of friction between the development process and the deployment process. So typically without containers, typically what we do is we build our application, and then when we deploy it, we make sure that the server is set up properly with the right dependencies, with the right folders, the right permissions, and all that stuff. So it's difficult to get all the environments the same. With Docker, we're able to kind of do all that stuff at when we're building the application. So we can actually specify exactly how Docker containers built. So all the dependencies and all the weirdnesses and the craziness that happens when we pack up or stuff stuff into the container. And then after that, we just deploy that container image, that exact same container image to all environments. So it's a lot more consistent that way. And at the heart of this is the Docker file. So the Docker file is really just a set of instructions to tell Docker how to basically set up your container image. So typically we start with a sort of like an image that you want to build from. And then we install dependencies, or we have instructions on how to install dependencies. We have instructions on how to build the application. And also we specify basically what to run when a container starts up. And then so we take the Docker file, and then we put it as part of our code base. And then we commit it to source control, and then the build process takes over. So the build server will basically grab all our files, and then it's going to run Docker build on the Docker file. And the output of that is a Docker image that it'll push up to an image registry like the Docker Hub. And then, like I was saying before, that same image gets deployed to all the different environments. So we're pretty confident that if something works on dev or QA, it's going to pretty much, there's a much better chance it's going to work in production. So far, the container story has been on Linux, which means for .NET, that's really just .NET Core applications, right? So what about all the stuff that we've been working on for the last 5, 10, or maybe in 15 years, right? Stuff like WebForms, MVC, Web API, SignalR, basically anything that requires the full .NET framework. What do we do there? That's where Windows containers come in. Windows Server containers are coming with Windows Server 2016, and currently that's in technical preview 5. And I think RTM is slated before the end of this year. Otherwise, I guess they have to change the name. And it comes in two flavors. There's Windows Server, which is the Windows Server that we know and love, and this new thing called Nano Server, which is basically a really stripped down version of Windows that it basically, as far as .NET's concerned, it's only going to run .NET Core. So we're not going to really talk about that too much here anyway. And these containers are actually native containers. So we might have heard of the Docker toolbox for Windows and the Docker for Windows, like it was in beta, and maybe it's RC or RTM right now. Those things actually install a Linux VM on your machine, and then you're able to work with Linux containers on them. But that's not really what we're talking about here. Like Windows Server containers are actually Windows containers on Windows, and we can run Windows applications on them. And just like we did with Linux, we're going to go over the architecture. Just like Linux, we have the operating system with a bunch of services in it that kind of enable containers to work. And we have the Docker engine on top that talks to these services that basically makes containers happen. So that's how we create containers, manage containers. This is actually a port of the Linux Docker engine, so it's pretty much exactly the same code base, but just basically built for Windows. And on top of that, we have the exact same REST API that we expose for, or the Linux version exposes. So that means all the applications that we're used to using with Linux will just basically work with it out of the box. So let's do a quick demo. Whoa, what happened? Okay, we're going to have to roll with this. It was a lot bigger before. Whoa. So here we can do Docker images. So right now I have a Windows Server 2016 Technical Preview 5 running on my machine. And yeah, it's in a VM on my Mac. When we do Docker images, there's some images in there already. So the Windows Server Core image is basically a clean install of Windows Server Core. So let's start up a container using one of those. So we can use Docker run --rm. That just means remove the container when I'm done with it. -it, which means I actually want to interact with the container itself. And we'll go Windows Server Core. And then cmd, which means we want to dive into a command prompt. So hopefully in a couple seconds, we're into the container itself. So we can do a directory listing. It's basically a clean install of Windows. Something else we can do is we can actually look at the task list. And this is basically everything that is running inside the container. So some services that are kind of required by Windows to be running there. How do I get out of this? So one thing we can look at, one other thing we can look at here is, oh my goodness, it's so small. Okay, we're gonna have to roll this too, I think. So if we look at sort of the tasks that are running on the host machine, so this is outside the container at this point, we'll see a bunch of stuff running under a job object ID. So in this case, is like 388. So these are the stuff that the containers can see. And it's really namespace of the container. So we can only see these outside the container, but inside the container, they can only see its own processes. Another thing we can look at is sort of the memory usage. So right now I'm using 2.2 gigs right here. So I have Visual Studio running right now, so that's like 2 gigs right there. So let's exit out of this container. Now we flip back. And we can see that the container was more or less using like about 100 to 200 megabytes. So not too bad. I mean, like it's not as lean and as a Linux container, but it is Windows after all. So at least it's working. I think I'm going to lose my MVP as well. All right, let's get back into the slides. So now, what are the different ways we can deploy ASP.NET to containers? The top one is basically the one that we hear about the most. ASP.NET Core running on .NET Core. That basically runs anywhere. So Linux containers, Windows containers, or even Nano server containers, it can run there. But ASP.NET Core running on the full framework, that one we can actually run it on Linux containers using Mono, which I believe is not supported. But it can run on Windows containers using the full .NET framework. And the next class of applications would be like things that can run in basically a self-hosted EXE. So things like a OM self-host. So things like Web API 2 or Signal R2. Those things will run fine in a Windows container. And the last group of applications are things that depend on system web and IIS. So that's things like WebForms and MVC5. What we have to do there is we can still run it on a Windows Server Core container, but we have to install IIS on it first. So we put IIS in there, and then we stuff the application in there. It sounds kind of crazy, but it works, and it actually works quite well. So let's take a look at that. Ooh. I really want to change the resolution, but I don't think I can. All right, so we have a really tiny Visual Studio. It's super tiny. So what we have is just a regular WebForms project. So you can tell it's WebForms. We got ASPX going on here. And we can actually go F5 and run it. I think I pressed F5. Maybe I didn't. Okay, I'll click it. Okay, here we go. So, and this is just running in IIS Express just to show that it's a WebForms application that runs. So there we go, super tiny, don't know why. And we can tell, it doesn't have the ASPX extensions because we have the friendly URLs turned on, but trust me, it's WebForms. Actually, we can tell it's WebForms because check it out, we got the view state. Yeah. Oh, it's good stuff. Brings back memories. All right, so let's get out of that. Why are you so tiny? So let's, okay, what else can we look at here? So let's take a look at the Docker file that we can use to build this. Thankfully, with VS Code, we can make this quite a bit bigger. So here's the Docker file. So the first line, we're basically saying, let's use this thing called Microsoft/IIS. That's actually an image that was put out by Microsoft to the Docker Hub. What they did was they just took the Windows Server Core image and added IIS onto it. So the next line that we're doing is we're just installing Chocolatey because we'll be installing a bunch of tools via the command line. And the next bunch of lines, if anyone's ever set up a build server before, you recognize these things. We're just setting up a bunch of tools for building the project. And then the next bunch of lines here, we are just basically copying the source code into the container itself. And then we are running .NET Restore. Let me bring it up a little higher. We're running .NET Restore on the application, and then we're actually building it. And then the last step is we're just copying the files into www. And the last step here is that is basically the entry point is the thing that Docker is going to run when it starts up a container. So right now we're telling it to basically run this PowerShell script that I have set up. So let's take a look at that script. So in most ASP.NET 4.5 type projects, typically what we do is we have like these web config transforms that we kind of use to kind of set up our web config according to the right environments. So this is what I'm doing here. So there's a little. We're basically, so with Docker, we can actually pass in environment variables as we start up a Docker container. So here what I'm doing is that I'm just checking for an environment variable called ASP.NET environment. And then I'm using that to figure out which web config transform to apply at the container startup. So it's kind of happening here. So let's take a quick look at the web config. Or not, the click will not work. No. Okay, well, we'll have to bypass that. Trust me, there's a web config going on there. So now let's build this thing. Ooh. Whoa, whoa, come back. All right, so what we would do, so let's do a Docker build. So we'll go Docker build -t .NET fringe dot. So basically we're saying, hey, Docker, please build an image, and the dot means from this folder, and tag it .NET fringe. So we'll do that. And it happens super fast. It's actually a lot slower than that, but because I built it before earlier, it's basically using it from cache. Otherwise, it probably would have taken like 3 minutes or something like that. And now we can actually run this container. So instead of typing, I'll just use this handy trick that I learned from somebody's blog. I ran it without describing it. But basically what we're doing is, well, we'll run the next one. We'll run the next one. No, I won't run the next one. Hold on. All right, let's describe it first. So we're doing Docker run and -d. See if I can scroll up a little bit. -d basically means instead of like us running in interactive mode and actually interacting with the container, we are saying let's run it in a detached or daemon mode so that it's going to run in the background. And then -p means what it's saying there is we're forwarding port 81 from the container host into port 80 inside the container. So inside the container, IIS is always listening to port 80. Because the first container, I started up using port 80 on the container host. If I started up the second container using port 80 as well, it's going to have a collision. So I'm actually using port 81. And the -e is just where we're setting the environment variable. So the first Docker run uses an environment variable. We set it to dev, and then the second one we set it to prod. So that's going to basically determine which web config transform it runs. Let's do that. Let's get out of there. So let's try running, or let's try browsing to these pages. Hopefully it works. So it is ASP.NET after all, so I'm going to have to dance a little bit while it kind of loads up. Should come up soon. I hope. Hey, there it is. So we got one running with the development configuration, and one running with the production configuration. So basically, the same applications that we had before, basically with no changes, we're able to run them inside of a container. So we're able to do all that, but what's the point of all that? I mean, like we did all these weird things, like we took a container, we shoved IIS into it, and then we put some old application into it. Why do we want to do that? One of the biggest advantage of that, I would say, is that we can use, because it is just a regular Docker container after it's been built, we can use Docker to basically deploy pretty much all our workloads now, because we can package our applications in either Linux containers or Windows containers. And then we can work with them the exact same way. And obviously, we can run multiple versions of .NET on the same machine now, because the .NET's actually inside the container and on our side. And again, we don't have to do anything to set up the servers. The servers just have to have containers enabled and the Docker engine installed. And basically, the client tools will talk to it and make things happen. And another cool thing that we can do is we can actually run combined Linux and Windows containers, Linux and Windows clusters. So something like Docker Swarm can actually run on a cluster that's got some Linux nodes and some Windows nodes. And then we can actually give this thing, give Windows containers to Docker Swarm, and it's going to know to deploy them to Windows nodes. And for Linux containers, it's going to know to deploy them to Linux nodes. So we can actually do things like having a Docker compose file that actually contains both Windows container images in there, and also Linux container images in there. So imagine if you wanted to do like a WebForms application that was talking to Redis, and you actually want to run Redis on Linux, you can totally do that. So in summary, I'm actually going kind of fast. Yeah, Docker and containers are pretty awesome. We can Dockerize pretty much any ASP.NET applications now, thanks to Windows Server containers. And Windows Server containers and Windows Server 2016 is coming hopefully in the second half of 2016. And we can, like I was saying before, we can manage Windows and Linux containers with the exact same tools. Some next steps. We can so if you're interested in trying out Windows Server 2016, I think you download the technical preview, try it out. Azure Container Services actually has a private preview for Windows containers out. So if you sign up for that, you can actually spin up one of these Docker Swarm clusters that has both Linux nodes and Windows nodes on it. And here's a link to the Microsoft documentation for containers, and also a link to my blog, shameless plug, that I have a couple of articles on there that basically describes everything that I talked about in the last 25 minutes. And that's it. Thanks.